Hello, everyone. We've covered a number of different types of pseudoscience, including young Earth creationism, climate change denial, anti vaxxers, etc. Today, we're going to look at conspiracies and pseudoscience in their broader socio historical context to understand how they became so numerous and vocal, and how we elect people to positions of power who propagate blatant pseudoscience, and what the end goal is for pseudoscience proponents. Specifically, we're going to look at three independent assaults on science: the industrial assault, the media assault, and the religious assault, and how they cross pollinated one another to create a populace that is distrustful of science and votes religious extremists into public office. So, let's jump right in. First, the industrial attack on science began, or at the very least, massively escalated in the late 1800s, the old robber baron era. The National Association of Manufacturers, or NAM, was founded in 1895 around calls for the government to impose tariffs protective of American businesses and to pressure the U.S. government to finish the Panama Canal, both of which would benefit American businesses. Ironically, while calling for specific federal actions, it was for intervention to help their moneyed interests, not legislation to help those at the bottom. NAM strongly opposed legislative regulations, such as removing children from the workforce, shortening the work week, or giving paid leave to sick or injured workers. After all, these regulations would mean less money for corporations and more freedom for the workers. To combat regulations, NAM would subsequently launch a massive propaganda campaign through pamphlets, books, and later radio programs, claiming that regulations are not only necessarily harmful to American businesses and therefore American freedom, but that any regulations at all are a slippery slope to socialism and communism, which were frequently equated. The National Electric Light Association, or NELA, which was a collection of electric utility companies, would even go on to pay for people to rewrite civics, economic, and business college textbooks to be more favorable towards electric companies. In 1928, the Federal Trade Commission would begin issuing a series of reports documenting the propaganda tactics of NELA, such as trying to erase the fact that the companies had to be given federal subsidies to build electric infrastructure in rural and poor urban areas, which NELA wouldn't do because it didn't think there would be enough return on investment. The rural electrification program wouldn't begin until the FDR New Deal, following the 1929 stock market crash and depression. This tactic of using large sums of money to influence public opinion towards favoring unregulated industries would continue into the post-World War II era, marshalling the tools of mass market advertising that endeavored to keep consumers attached to their advertisers' products. By the 1970s, the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company hired respected American physicist Frederick Seitz to divvy up certain company funds and direct them as grants towards biomedical research. Why, you might be wondering, would a tobacco company do that? We know that smoking is strongly correlated with the development of lung cancer, so what reason would there be for a tobacco company to pay medical scientists for their research? That's where Seitz came in. Seitz already had a foot in the medical world since he previously helped launch a variety of research programs involving molecular biology, cell biology, and neuroscience. He advised R.J. Reynolds and the tobacco industry more broadly to invest massive amounts of money into medical research programs that were totally unrelated to tobacco and lung cancer. What foods increase the prevalence of cancers? What behaviors increase the prevalence of cancer? What mutations increase the prevalence of cancer? The point was to show that, in actuality, a lot of different things cause cancer, so we can't really say for certain that smoking is strongly correlated with lung cancer. Of course, this was just misdirection, as the tobacco industry had privately known since the 1950s that tobacco smoke was carcinogenic. Seitz's job was merely to create reasonable doubt in the public mind, which would sway them away from voting for politicians proposing regulations. Fortunately, this tactic ultimately failed when more of the factual data emerged and the tobacco industry was found guilty of executing a scheme to defraud consumers in 2006. In 1984, Seitz would found a conservative think tank with two other American physicists, William Nierenberg and Robert Jastrow, called the George C. Marshall Institute, that sought to drum up public support for Ronald Reagan's ridiculous Star Wars program, as well as cast doubt on the existence of anthropogenic acid rain and global warming. The methods these three men used included writing for the popular press, such as Jastrow defending Star Wars in the Wall Street Journal and the conservative magazine Commentary, and helping to sabotage government policy panels on anthropogenic acid rain and climate change, both of which Nierenberg unfortunately chaired. The Austrian born physicist Fred Singer, who worked for the Heritage Foundation, the group responsible for today's Project 2025 authoritarian playbook of the Trump administration, and later created the Science and Environmental Policy Project, took what amounted to a meat axe to any science that challenged their ideological preferences. He lied to the public about the effects of chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, on the depletion of the ozone layer in the 1980s, the carcinogenic effects of secondhand smoke, and later on the effects of burning fossil fuels in relation to Earth's warming climate. With regard to CFCs, Singer claimed the ozone that was missing simply moved elsewhere in the atmosphere, which was shown to be false immediately thanks to satellite data, that the solution to the ozone hole was too expensive, which was false since most people had already stopped using CFC-containing products, that the true cause of the ozone hole was volcanic chlorine, which wasn't possible since very little volcanic chlorine even made it to the stratosphere, and that the ozone hole was the result of a natural cycle for which there was no evidence in the scientific literature. If any of that sounds familiar, it's because all of these talking points would later be recycled for the attack on anthropogenic climate change. Their work caused President George W. Bush's rejection of the Kyoto Protocol, caused President Bush to label climate change a Chinese hoax, and that sentiment was echoed a decade later by President Donald Trump. These four men, Seitz, Singer, Nierenberg, and Jastrow, are virtually never discussed in the popular media, and yet they are almost singularly responsible for the widespread denial of climate change. They should be famous for the damage they did to the public's relation with science. Why, you might ask, would three exceptionally accomplished physicists work to destroy science, the very thing they spent their lives building? Well, there are three primary reasons. The first is political. They spent much of their adulthood in the Cold War, and thus had a deep hatred of communism. Using the playbook of manufacturing corporations, these men argued that any regulations were pure-blooded communism and should therefore be opposed. Second, the lure of political ambition and influence. Seitz, Nierenberg, and Jastrow benefited from a great deal of both through their involvement in weapons research. However, as a 2008 paper notes, quote, in the 1980s, impact sciences, i.e. lines of scientific inquiry focused on the detrimental environmental effects of human actions, grew significantly and began to divert scientific funds from production sciences, oriented towards the production of things through traditional applications of engineering, economics, physics, and chemistry, close quote. And third, a Pollyanna-ish view of the capacity of market economies to engineer their way out of systemic challenges. These men have a deep faith that technological innovation will remove the need for regulations. Of course, our future potential ability to have less environmentally harmful practices doesn't negate the fact that our practices are harming the environment currently. Which brings us to the popular media attack on science. Journalists are not, for the most part, historians or scientists, so the attack on science from the media comes less from a direct intentional assault and more from a lack of thorough investigative reporting and subject matter expertise. While some may argue that the influence of certain philosophies on journalism studies has convinced students that science is just one more way of knowing, I'm willing to bet that a greater issue is simply lack of knowledge or effort. To be sure, science can be hard. The higher level concepts are genuinely difficult to understand. Thus, the burden falls on public schools to give students a robust foundation in science, math, history, and literature. However, there are myriad issues with public schools, including underfunding, overcrowding, and stagnating wages for teachers. And not all students will go to college. That's not necessarily a bad thing. College is expensive and trade jobs are critically important for society. But by not going to college, many people will miss out on taking subjects that they might not have had access to in public school, thus being robbed of knowledge that could make them more informed voters. Pseudoscience is more prominent than ever because corporations have more money than they've ever had to sway public opinion, and too many of their audience lack the basic method skills to evaluate whether the claims they hear are valid. That there is no journalistic marketplace of ideas was made especially apparent in the Dominion lawsuit against Fox News in 2021. Dominion Voting Systems sued Fox News for spreading the false claim that Dominion's voting machines had been rigged to throw the 2020 election for Joe Biden, and internal communication among the Fox News hosts like Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity showed that the hosts knew this was a lie. However, they pushed the conspiracy anyway because they observed the network was losing conservative viewers to OAN and Newsmax, which pushed the conspiracy first. Because Dominion could show the facts, Fox News ended up settling out of court, paying almost $800 million for their lies. But while Carlson lost his job at Fox, he simply moved to other media and was prominently on display at the 2024 GOP convention. In this polarized environment where millions dismiss contrary information as fake news, many conservatives still think the 2020 election was stolen. By a January 2022 CNN poll, it was some 67% of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents. Another problem is that even when thorough investigative reporting is possible, it's not necessarily financially feasible. News organizations chase article clicks, which generate advertising revenue, so if a story doesn't generate enough clicks, then there will be less desire for a similar story in the future. This so-called marketplace of ideas places less of a value on accountability and objectivity for flashy headlines. This is why articles come out with titles like New Fossil Overturns Anthropology or Star Changes Everything We Know About the Universe. No one wants to click on an article titled Fossil Fills in Known Gap in Paleontological Record or Star Discovery Results in Slight Modification to Existing Models. Ironically, the media trying to balance discussions can also be detrimental to science communication. For instance, if the topic is anthropogenic climate change, a news organization might host a roundtable discussion between an expert climatologist and someone paid directly by the fossil fuel industry to misrepresent climate change data. This is not a scientific debate, it's a show for ratings. If the climate change denier wanted to argue for science, that person would publish in the scientific literature, not the popular press. Putting an expert visually on par with an industry crank communicates to the audience that these are equally valid positions when they aren't. And hand in hand with the denigration of science by industries and the media has come the rise of various flavors of pseudoscience. Concomitant with the countercultural revolution of the 1960s and 1970s, New Age mysticism has sprung up, including healing crystals, psychic and aura readings, hypnosis, tarot, astral projection, chakra adjustment, extrasensory perception, astrology, and quantum woo, among other nonsense. Its defenders, like Deepak Chopra, treat New Age as a way of knowing on par with science, and after all, if science is just another meta-narrative of the dominant culture, then it can be ignored in favor of other equally valid meta-narratives. The combination of industrial and media attacks on science, the spread of New Age mysticism, and very real failures of trusted institutions like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment or the Watergate scandal have created a culture of fear and anti-intellectualism in the U.S. Knee-jerk, uninformed reactions to genetically modified crops, the discovery of harmful common household products like asbestos and leaded paint, and ironically, the discovery of products like CFCs are causing a hole in the ozone layer, which has led to increased rates of melanoma in certain regions, have fomented a vague general belief that the government is poisoning us. Some charlatans have seized on this narrative to create multi-level marketing, or MLM, schemes. These are businesses where a company pays non-salaried workers to distribute the company's products or services, recruit other workers, and the workers receive payment based on the volume of products or services sold. To be clear, studies of MLMs have shown that over 99% of workers lose profits. They are indistinguishable from classic pyramid schemes. Common products sold by MLMs include some brands of press-on nails, leggings, and relevant to here, essential oils. Essential oils are liquid compounds extracted from plants, and they're commonly used in aromatherapy, which involves evaporating substances to supposedly induce psychological or bodily well-being. While some people may indeed feel relaxed from good smells, there is no evidence that aromatherapy treats any known diseases or psychological states. Unfortunately, this "the government is poisoning us" narrative has reached a fever pitch in recent decades, especially following the 1998 publication of an article by Andrew Wakefield claiming to link the measles vaccine with autism in the British medical journal Lancet. Even though this claim was immediately debunked, Wakefield has continued to spread his lies, although upgrading from "the MMR vaccine causes autism" to "all vaccines cause autism." Right now, the anti-vaccine lunatic Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. is working with the Trump administration and has been named the head of Health and Human Services. The anti-vax movement has grown exponentially in the last 20 years, flying in the face of the massive successes of epidemiology. We turn now to the third attack on science, religious extremism, which we'll see isn't unconnected with the other two. When the first versions of transformationism, which would later be called biological evolution, were being proposed by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck and Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire in the early 1800s, their contemporary creationists like Georges Cuvier responded with arguments we recognize today. No transitional fossils, discontinuity in extant organismal morphology, only limited variation within kinds. Despite 200 years of research, Answers in Genesis, the Institute for Creation Research, and the Discovery Institute apparently see no need to update these talking points. By the 1970s, charismatic evangelists like Billy Graham, Pat Robertson, and Jerry Falwell took to the airwaves to spread their fire and brimstone gospel. Repent of your ways or face an afterlife worse than death itself. Sociologist Sarah Diamond described the growth of the Christian conservative movement this way, quote, "It is a political movement rooted in a rich evangelical subculture, one that offers participants both the means and the motivation to try to take dominion over secular society. The means include a phenomenal number of religious broadcast stations, publishing houses, churches, and grassroots lobbies. The motivation is to preach the gospel and to save souls, but also, with equal urgency, to remake contemporary moral culture in the image of Christian scripture. On the front lines of our persisting battle over what kind of society we are and will become, the Christian right wages political conflict not just through the ballot box, but also through the movement's very own cultural institutions." Close quote. Leading the way for the Christian right was Jerry Falwell, an American Baptist pastor. Falwell was perturbed about a number of things in America, such as the 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education that ruled racial segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. Falwell said, quote, "If Chief Justice Warren and his associates had known God's word and had desired to do the Lord's will, I am quite confident that the 1954 decision would never have been made. The facilities should be separate." Close quote. He further argued that black people don't actually want to be desegregated and that Martin Luther King Jr. was a communist. What really set him off, apparently, was the Green versus Connolly decision, after which the Internal Revenue Service announced it could, quote, "no longer legally justify allowing tax-exempt status to private schools which practice racial discrimination," close quote. Both Falwell's Lynchburg Christian School and Bob Jones University were racially segregated and thus were furious when their tax-exempt statuses were revoked. At the same time, American political activist Paul Weyrich, who had co-founded the aforementioned Heritage Foundation in 1973, saw the rumblings of a nascent political movement. Weyrich had for years tried to stir up public support against things he considered morally objectionable, such as pornography, prayer in schools, and abortion, but none of these had worked. With the IRS going after Falwell and other evangelical leaders, Weyrich saw his opportunity. He developed a message to his religious contemporaries that the Democrats were really the ones behind the IRS. Never mind that the IRS pulling tax exemption from segregated schools was mandated by Nixon, a Republican, and Bob Jones University lost its tax-exempt status under Gerald Ford, another Republican. Though some evangelical leaders had already begun banding together under a unified anti-desegregation banner, they needed a different rallying cry if evangelicals were to become a serious voting bloc. Now, with the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, evangelicals could use anti-abortion messaging to draw adherents. Weyrich recruited evangelical leaders to preach that the legalization of abortion would lead inevitably to infanticide and euthanasia. In 1979, Falwell and Weyrich co-founded the Moral Majority, an organization that championed positions like anti-abortion, anti-divorce, anti-feminism, and anti-LGBT rights. By the end of Reagan's presidential term in 1989, the Christian right had solidified and became dominant in the GOP. 3 decades of activity to marshal their side as a bloc and influence policy at all levels via such organizations as the Secretive Council for National Policy, closely connected to creationist Tony Perkins' Family Research Council, with members that include Steve Bannon and Kellyanne Conway, has brought a number of right-wing Christian fundamentalists into power, including surgeon Ben Carson, who ran for president, Ron Paul, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, who has authored articles for Answers in Genesis, and Mike Huckabee, a creationist, climate change denier, opponent of LGBT rights and abortion, and now nominated to be ambassador to Israel. These are baseline positions for Republicans at this point. And to be thorough, the Intelligent Design Promoting Discovery Institute, whose leaked internal documents showed they advocate for a theocracy, was briefly among the advisory board for the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. Another branch of the Christian right came from the John Birch Society, or JBS. If the Moral Majority brought evangelicalism to the right, the JBS brought conspiracy theories. Founded in 1958, the JBS grew from the insane ramblings of American businessman Robert W. Welch Jr. Foundational to the fomenting of a mobilized middle and lower class with the JBS was Welch's improvisational conspiracism, defined as, quote, an eclectic mix of millenarian religion, which advocates for a fundamental transformation of society, occultism, and radical politics, which enables the creation of novel belief systems. These novel belief systems give the believer a holistic and comprehensive picture of the world, which can explain a wide range of phenomena. Yet, improvisational conspiracism can only be maintained with a backdrop of a social religious structure that is capable of revealing connections at multiple levels, coupled with a weak authority structure that permits these ideas to crystallize and take hold. Close quote. One common refrain of Welch's teachings was that a secret cabal of evil people were behind all the workings of government. And who was this group, you ask? The 18th century Bavarian secret society known as the Illuminati. Welch alleged that the Illuminati controlled the government. They pressured FDR to provoke the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. They gave communistic orders to Presidents Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower. And they controlled the nominees and policies of both Democrats and Republicans. The goal of the Illuminati? To unite all governments, nationalities, and races into one. And where did Welch acquire all this information on the supposedly ultra-secretive group? From largely unnamed or unreliable sources. How convenient. To lead the charge against this cabal, Welch called upon American businessmen, the defenders of free enterprise, to support his crusade, similarly to what NAM had done in decades past. As religion historian Carmen Celestini notes, quote, through his initial foray in the establishment of one man's opinion, Welch marketed to the businessmen and wealthy industrialists the need to fight for their inheritance in the American dream. Marketing directly to this group, he linked their role as leaders to the mobilization against communism and in support of free enterprise. Once he had secured their financial support and their engagement in leading the mobilization of the middle class, Welch moved to the second stage of his plan, the establishment of the JBS. After creating the JBS in 1958, Welch began to focus on fear to mobilize a portion of the American middle class. Branding their activism for conservative ideals under the moniker of Americanism as Americanist heroes, he instilled in the JBS members a fear of impending disaster. Contemporary developments in society, such as the civil rights movement, government welfare programs, and a growing secularism, became Welch's evidence of a decay of Christian civilization in America, a crisis that needed Americanist heroes to save the traditions of free enterprise, religion, and family. Close quote. The JBS has had a resurgence in recent years, but its methodological and spiritual successor, pun intended, would be QAnon, the multifaceted conspiracy theory generating cult. Although conspiracy theories are far from rare in America, Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign explicitly made use of conspiracy theories, in particular those revolving around the deep state. According to Trump, the deep state is a collection of corrupt political officials in Washington who represent a swamp that must be drained. On the website 4chan in 2017, an individual identified as Q would leave cryptic messages for his followers called Q drops. These messages include predictions that Hillary Clinton would be arrested, to discrediting prominent Trump critics and announcing state persecution of political opponents, to smear campaigns against immigrants, liberals and left-wingers, nationalist slogans, and anti-Semitic narratives, or completely unintelligible news about allegedly imminent events. As sociologists Heiko Bayer and Niklas Herberg wrote, quote, "In light of this, the QAnon theory entails not a single narrative, but a combination of different tropes and stories held together by a clear-cut Manichaeism. Trump and his supporters are fighting against evil in America and the world, particularly if we consider the images of the diabolical elite who drink children's blood, control politics, the economy, and the media, and rule the world through socialism and feminism. The resemblance with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, which of course are much older, becomes clear. Furthermore, as well as these global classifications, events such as 9/11, the Kennedy assassination, or the outbreak of the COVID pandemic in China's Wuhan are also interwoven into the interpretations, and these are explained with recourse to the plans and actions of those satanic elites. Mike Rothschild therefore describes QAnon succinctly as a conspiracy about everything, close quote. In the wake of COVID-19, QAnon has grown further. As a 2022 study found, quote, people exhibiting more conspiracy belief were less likely to comply with public health regulations concerning the COVID-19 pandemic and showed more religious fundamentalism, close quote. Unfortunately, it isn't just internet randos who express support for QAnon, but individuals at our highest levels of government, including Georgia Republican Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, who indicated support for executing Democrat politicians before being elected to Congress, Elon Musk, who tweeted out his support for the Pizzagate conspiracy, and retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, who served in the first Trump administration. So when you turn on the news, shaking your head in dismay and asking, how did we get here? The answer is a century of sustained attacks on science by industries and religious fundamentalists, unwittingly aided by a science-illiterate public media. We got here by corporations paying out billions of dollars to people who would lie on their behalf. We got here by evangelicals and creationists screaming from the pulpit, and then later TV and the internet, about evolution. And we got here by journalists refusing or being too lazy to stand up for truth, or failing miserably to convey the incompetent source methods underpinning all branches of the pseudoscience and political extremism subculture. In the resulting vacuum left by scientific and democratic institutions, illiberal authoritarian solutions are pushed. Pull funding from universities, such as limiting the amount of federal funding going towards maintaining buildings and equipment, and paying support staff and other overhead expenses. Erase embarrassing or uncomfortable information from websites like the now removed National Institute of Justice article, Undocumented Immigrant Offending Rate Lower Than U.S. Born Citizen Rate, and go door-to-door arresting people, which is what ICE agents have been doing in Colorado. These are the Project 2025 brand of solutions that are already being attempted by Donald Trump. And now that we're here, what do we do next? First, we become informed. Tell your friends, your relatives about these people and their plans. We must be more informed than the creationists and conspiracy theorists. Second, we must organize. We have to recruit other people to our cause of defending science, because if we don't, then no one will. And finally, we must vote. We must vote against charlatans and frauds. We must vote against the interests of fossil fuel industries and religious extremists, not just for ourselves, but for our children too. This isn't the end, it's just another chance for us to start anew. So, thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you all next time.